Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, see that little subscribe button at the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, click that subscribe button. Really does help our channel grow, our audience grow, and I really do appreciate it more than you know. So click that subscribe button. Appreciate your support. Now, here's the video that you came here for. Place to start. How about this? Texas at Texas A&M. Saw this right before we started recording on Monday via TickPick. This is, according to TickPick, the most expensive regular season ticket in the history of their website. More expensive than any regular season college football game or NFL game, as the get-in price, as we're recording on Monday, is around $700. The average purchase price is over $1,000. And it's with good reason, because these two schools hate each other. These two schools haven't played in a while. And boy, oh boy, oh boy, is there a lot at stake. Kind of crazy to think about. We went into last weekend and the stakes were clear. Texas and Texas A&M at the time were tied alone atop the SEC standings. Texas A&M loses. What does it mean? Does it take anything out of this game? No. Because Ole Miss lost, because Alabama lost, guess what? The winner of this game will again go to the SEC championship game, and I think unofficially clinch a college football playoff berth. We can have that conversation down the road because there is so much at stake in this game. Two fascinating teams, and two teams that I'm just so excited for this game. For anybody who is lucky enough to be there, enjoy it, have fun, take it all in. The rest of us are jealous. In terms of this game, listen, the big story coming into this one, we all know what it is. It is obviously the history and the rivalry, but from the Texas A&M side of things, it's the fact that they're coming off a loss. And it was a weird game at Auburn late in the season. Now, transparently, we're going to talk about Auburn in a minute with Auburn and Alabama in the Iron Bowl. Auburn's not that bad. And I'm not saying that a Texas A&M fan should accept that loss, should be okay with that loss. But at the same time, Auburn has been a tough, competitive team all season long. Could have beaten, probably should have beaten Missouri, should have beaten Oklahoma, could have beaten some other teams, so it doesn't feel good to lose that game, but I think Auburn's probably a little bit better than people realize. And I do think from the Texas A&M side of things, I think there is a little bit of positive that came out of that game. First of all, Texas A&M has been sort of a one-dimensional team offensively for most of this season. The good news is that as Marcel Reed has comfortably taken that starting quarterback spot, he is getting more comfortable in the pocket as a passer. Thought this was probably his best game as a passer, 22 of 35, 297 yards passing, 3 touchdowns in this game. The run game was still very effective for A&M, 167 yards on the ground, 52 carries for the Aggies. Obviously, they're dealing with some injuries in that backfield, but Amari Daniels is still playing very well. 90 yards rushing in that game, 8 touchdowns on the season, including 1 in each of the last 3 games. So Texas A&M, you don't want to lose that game to Auburn. But also, I think the flip side is the offense, I think, is rounding into form. The defense has been good all year. No, I don't take a ton out of the fact that Auburn had success. By the way, if you watch the game, you saw that Auburn jumped on them early. Texas A&M did a much better job in the second half of slowing them down. And then obviously the 43 points in overtime, a lot of that came via the extra period. For Texas, I'll say this about Texas is I've said since pretty much the Michigan game in week 2 that Texas is maybe the best team that I have seen at their best. What I would also say is this is not a team that is playing great football, or I don't want to say that. They're winning games, but I feel like they're leaving something a little bit to be desired. The Kentucky game, if you watched on Saturday, Texas is coming off a home senior day win against Kentucky. If you did not watch that game, Texas was a 20.5-point favorite. They end up winning by 17. It was a weird game where you never really felt like Texas was not going to win that game. But at the same time, it was never one where they just really put their foots on the throat of Kentucky and put them out of their misery. Bottom line was, if you watch the game, Texas does finish with 442 yards of total offense. They ran the ball very effectively, 251 yards on the ground. They did have 2 turnovers, but again, just a weird game where they just, it felt like it was never really in question. but there was never really a doubt that they were going to, there's never really a doubt they were going to lose, but it just never felt like they totally clicked and they totally just buried Kentucky, as I said a minute ago. And so when I look at this game, it is also worth noting that coming in, now we're recording here Monday night, okay? A lot can change between Monday night and Saturday. But obviously the big news from Texas that is worth noting before we get into my official pick of this game is that is the fact that Quinn Ewers is banged up. Had an ankle injury in that Kentucky game. He called it, quote, tender after that game. Steve Sarkisian said on Monday that Quinn Ewers would be practicing. Right now, there's no speculation that he won't be playing, but that is something worth keeping an eye on going into this one. And so let's make our official pick. By the way, I didn't even mention, I'm so excited about the ticket prices. Didn't even mention Texas, by the way, a 5.5-point favorite. The over-under set at 48.5. Again, we're recording early in the week. These things are going to change, but I actually like Texas A&M to cover, and I would not be surprised if they win. So my official best bet is Texas A&M minus or plus 5.5, excuse me. First thing, one, I actually just don't think it's a terrible matchup for Texas A&M. Texas A&M, listen, they are a little bit limited offensively, but as I said, Marcel Reed is improving in the pass game. The run game has been good all year. That defensive line with Nick Scorton, Shamar Stewart, they can get after people. But there's really a couple other variables that really do make me think that Texas A&M will keep this close and maybe win outright. The first one, just the health of Quinn Ewers. We just talked about it a second ago, but that is a kid that has played in a lot of tough environments, won in Alabama last year. But not having him at 100%, that's got to scare you against, again, a very good Texas A&M pass rush, 78 tackles for loss this year. That's like top 20 nationally. So they get after the quarterback. How does that impact the offense if Quinn Ewers is playing on one leg or isn't 100% against this pass rush? Speaking of Texas, I got to call a spade a spade. They haven't been very good the last couple weeks. And listen, this isn't a knock Texas, tear them down. They're the worst program that's ever walked the face of the earth. But at the same time, if you actually have watched the games, keep this in mind. Texas has played 4 games since they lost to Georgia. So they obviously get embarrassed by Georgia at home. Then they play Vandy on the road. They win 27-21, a game that, again, I don't want to say that they could have lost or should have lost or would have lost, but it was a little too close for comfort. And even if Vandy is an improved team, that's one coming off a loss that you want to take care of business if you're Texas. From there, they get a bye. From there, they play a bad Florida. Florida wasn't bad, but they were without DJ Lagway, so that was obviously the third-string quarterback that Florida was down to. So, yes, Texas took care of business against Florida with a third-string quarterback that was playing at Yale a year ago. But then the last 2 weeks, Arkansas felt a lot like the Kentucky game that I just described a minute ago. Texas on the road at Arkansas, Texas at home against Kentucky. 2 games where it never really felt like they were going to lose, but it never really felt like they were in control either. And so I look at this team. They haven't been playing great. And here's the other thing. This will be by far the toughest road environment that they have been part of this entire season, right? You look at the fact that Texas has played basically 4 true road games. At Michigan, that one was tough. Credit to them. They took care of business. Vandy, sorry, most of the fans there were were Texas fans. Arkansas, that fan base is down right now. They don't want to, you look at the ticket prices. It was easy to get in. There were a lot of empty seats, a lot of Texas fans at that game. This game will be insane in College Station. You don't need me to tell you, like I said, one of the most expensive tickets in the history of college football, especially in the regular season. That matters to me. And I was even thinking about this. Listen, I don't want to overreact to something, but have we noticed a trend in all these Saturday night college football games on ESPN in the SEC? An awful lot of them are being won by the home teams, right? South Carolina upsets Texas A&M. Alabama gets upset by Oklahoma last week. By the way, Alabama upset Georgia at home. Georgia beats Tennessee. LSU beats Ole Miss. Ole Miss beats this team. Again, Texas A&M beats LSU. And so I bring it up because it has just been so tough to win on the road late in in a night game environment. And listen, it's a metaphor for college football right now. You look at college football, there's no easy games. The playing field is kind of flattened, especially in the SEC with the portal, with NIL, with this, with that. And so listen, could I see Texas winning a 31-28 walk-off game, field goal in the final minute? Yeah, I could. But I think 5.5 on the road with a quarterback that is not going to be 100%. I think it's way too much. Texas A&M plus 5.5 is my official best bet. A game that always has a lot at stake. And even though it doesn't have quite as much as in previous years, there is still plenty on the line when Michigan and Ohio State get together, in the Horseshoe Saturday afternoon, high noon Eastern. Michigan traveling to Columbus on a 3-game win streak. Yeah, this ain't your grandfather's Michigan or your older brother's Michigan, because Ohio State is a 20.5-point favorite in this game. The over-under set at 43.5. And so listen, we know coming into this game, it's not quite the same level that it has been each of the last 3 years. Obviously, the winner of this game each of the last 3 years was going to go to the Big Ten championship game. The loser, you felt like, was certainly eliminated from the Big Ten title chase, but pretty much the playoff as well. I know Ohio State got in 2 years ago, so it's not quite the same that's at stake. Ohio State, by the way, has not clinched a spot in the SEC champion or in the Big Ten championship game, They still have to win this game. Otherwise, Penn State or Indiana would go. Again, Ohio State already has one loss to Oregon. So the point being that Ohio State needs to win this game to clinch a trip to Indianapolis. Let's talk about these teams. Michigan, I'll say this. I don't know that there's like a weirder team to analyze right now than Michigan. They're coming off of a national championship, 15-0, one of the greatest college football seasons that we've ever seen. I won't, say are they the greatest team ever, but one of the greatest seasons that we've ever seen. They lose 40-plus seniors to graduation, a bunch of guys to the NFL. Jim Harbaugh goes. Minter goes as his defensive coordinator. Minter looks like he's going to be an NFL head coach soon. So you knew there'd be a step back, but we didn't think they'd be 6-5 going into this game. But the counter is, how worried can you be if you're a Michigan fan? Because Bryce Underwood committed last week. So it felt like, again, just a weird couple months. The team isn't as good as expected, but you got the Bryce Underwood positive vibes coming out of last weekend. But then, let me also say this. Speaking of positive vibes coming out of last weekend, did you watch the game against Northwestern? If you did it was the first time that Michigan looked like Michigan really all season long. Final score in the Northwestern win that gets Michigan Bowl eligible, 50-6 in this one. Close to 400 yards of total offense. They complete 11 of 16 third down, so they were very efficient. 201 yards rushing, 5.7 yards per carry, 3 touchdowns from Kalel Mullings. So this finally feels like the Michigan team that we were expecting. And I think it's also worth noting with Michigan is that the defense is still pretty good. Because the offense is so bad, because of the fact they rank 128th nationally out of 134 FBS teams in total offense, it is worth noting that the defense is still in the top 20 nationally, and the run defense is still elite coming into this game, number 4 rush defense in all of college football. So you look at Michigan, they're still getting it done on the defensive front. Kenneth Grant, Mason Graham are going to be first-round picks. And you look at Michigan, most of these games, if they had just competent quarterback play, they would be in much better shape than they are right now. We hope that Bryce Underwood alleviates that. From the Ohio State perspective, obviously the vibes are different in a different way. The recruiting is still going good, but the on-the-field product is going very good as well for Ohio State. And listen, we all watched the Indiana game on Saturday. You all saw it. Will Howard putting out the SIG in the shoe. It was a great win. It was a dominant win. But let me also say this. I do think there's a tiny bit of revisionist history in how that game actually went down. And we talked about this a little bit on the Aaron Torres pod the other day, okay? So listen, nobody is arguing that Ohio State was the clearly superior team in that game. That is not what I'm saying at all. The defense is elite across the board, but it's also sort of worth noting a couple things. One, Ohio State's offense still is not fully clicking. Now, again, I understand there's 2 starters on the offensive line that are out for the season, and so that certainly doesn't help. The run game is ranked in the 40s nationally. The pass game isn't great this year either. And really, this is a defense-based team. And to go back to the Indiana game, can we call a spade on the Indiana game? Indiana gifted that team 14 points. We talked about it on the Aaron Torres pod. The bottom line is that Indiana is a team that does not beat themselves. 2 crucial mistakes basically give Ohio State 14 points. The muff punt right before halftime, the Caleb Downs punt return right after halftime. And so I just bring it up because I understand that the win was great and it meant something and it was significant. I also don't think that Ohio State is some unbeatable juggernaut. That 38-15 game looks a lot different if it is actually 24-15 and Indiana doesn't give you all those points. And so when I look at this game, my official pick for Saturday in the horseshoe, I'm actually going to take the under 43.5. And to be transparent, if I thought Michigan could move the football at all, I would actually probably take Michigan to, at the very least, cover the 20.5. The counter to that is if Michigan could move the football at all, then they wouldn't be a 20.5 point underdog. But I just think, listen, I know I was just a little critical of the Ohio State offense, and Ohio State fans, I understand you're dealing with injuries along the O-line. But the one thing that can't be denied about Ohio State, the defense is just so elite. And the thing is, like, sometimes you're elite on one side of the ball at one thing. You have a great pass game, a great run game, a great pass defense, a great run defense. I know Ohio State is elite everywhere across the board in college football on the defensive side of the football. Number one in total defense. Number one in scoring defense, number 3 in rush defense, giving up under 100 yards per game, and number 4 in pass defense as well. And so when I look at this game, I do think that Michigan front can give Ohio State fits. Listen, I hate to say it, Ohio State fans, Indiana kind of gave you fits along the offensive front as well. Like their defensive front, your offensive front, okay? But at the same time, it's hard for me to see the scenario where Michigan is able to move the football at all on what is a great Ohio State defense, great at all 3 levels. And I got to give credit where it's due. Jim Knowles is a highly paid defensive coordinator, a highly compensated defensive coordinator. He earned his paycheck last week as the Ohio State defensive coordinator. Indiana had no answers. Curtis Rourke was running for his life. Curtis Rourke had a big fumble, by the way, that didn't end up mattering because Ohio State didn't cash it in. But this defense is elite. I still do have questions about the Ohio State offense. So my best bet, I will say Ohio State wins. I don't know about the cover. The under is my best bet of 43.5 because, look, I just don't think Michigan's going to be able to move the ball at all on this defense, but I think the Michigan defense is probably a little bit better than we give it credit for. I'll say something in the neighborhood of like a 23-24-7 win Ohio State. I like Ohio State to win. And I like the under of 43.5. Iron Bowl. Yeah, we're going down to Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Auburn at Alabama. Alabama, an 11.5 point favorite. The over-under set at 52.5. But here's the bottom line. If Auburn is supposed to lose by 2 touchdowns, those players don't know it because they're coming off of a win over Texas A&M, and they are very confident coming into this game. Producer Matt, let's see what DeMarcus Riddick, the true freshman linebacker at Auburn, said going into the week. This was on Monday. He said, quote, Ryan Williams, who of course is the star wide receiver at Alabama, ain't no big-time player to me. I will not lose to Bama while I'm here. Oh, my goodness. By the way, Cam Coleman, the true freshman wide receiver at Auburn, had some comments as well. So Auburn is not ducking the smoke going into this game. And I'll be honest, they should feel good coming out of last week against Texas A&M. Because if you watch the Texas A&M game, frankly, if you've watched this Auburn team all year, I'm not saying Auburn is Georgia or Texas or Oregon or Ohio State, but they're not as bad as their record indicates, and they are getting better over the course of this season. We talked about it on the show last week. Peyton Thorne, I don't know how many people realize this, coming into last Saturday, has 1 interception since the 1st of October. Okay, September was a disaster. 5 turnovers against Arkansas, 4 turnovers against Cal. Not all of them were on him, but a lot of them were. Since October 1, he had 1 interception coming into last week, 1 interception last week against Texas A&M, but he also threw 2 touchdown passes. He's playing better. Auburn had almost 500 yards of total offense in that game against Texas A&M, and it is worth noting, Cam Coleman is emerging as a star. This was the 5-star receiver originally committed to Texas A&M. He flipped to Auburn around this time last year. Well, Cam Coleman against Texas A&M last week, 7 catches, 128 yards, 2 touchdowns. This after having 8 catches for 100 yards against UL Monroe. So you have a star emerging at wide receiver. Jarquez Hunter is one of the best running backs in the SEC. Peyton Thorne is playing better. And oh, by the way, Auburn does have a top 15 defense in all of college football and is especially good against the run. That's interesting going into an Alabama game where Alabama is reeling, okay? So we know about Auburn coming off the big win, but let's talk a second about Alabama. And listen, I get a lot of stuff wrong. This isn't I told you so. You should always listen to me. I've never got anything wrong. But I picked Oklahoma I picked the under in that game last week because I thought it was going to be super low scoring. And what did I say? And I've been consistent on this since the Vandy game. I've said I don't know what Alabama's offense is when Jalen Milroe isn't picking up huge chunks of yards as a runner on offense. Again, you go back to Alabama's losses this year. You go back to the game against Tennessee. In that game, Jalen Milroe finished for Alabama with 14 rushes for 11 yards rushing in that game. The Texas A&M or the Oklahoma game this past weekend, by the way, even worse. Jalen Milroe as a runner, 15 carries, 7 yards rushing. Okay. And so you look at what this offense becomes when Jalen Milroe can't run. It is easy. Listen, I'm not a scheme expert. I'm not a former coach. I'm not claiming that I have all the answers. But all these highly paid defensive coordinators and head coaches in the SEC have seemed to figure it out. If you can slow down Jalen Milroe, there really isn't that much to this offense. And I think that's got to be a big concern coming into this Auburn game, where, again, as I said, Auburn not only has one of the best total defenses in all of college football, but they are very good against the run. Auburn on the season ranks in the top 20 in run defense. By the way, that is 4th in the SEC. You know who's ahead of them? Tennessee, which beat Alabama. Oklahoma, it's 5th in the SEC, excuse me. Tennessee beat Alabama. Oklahoma is ahead of Auburn. They beat Alabama. South Carolina gave Alabama fits, and Auburn as well, in addition to Ole Miss, who, of course, is not on Alabama's schedule. And so when I look at this game, I'm going to call a spade a spade. I like Auburn to cover. And I'll be honest, I don't think it would surprise me at this point if Alabama were to lose this game outright. It sounds crazy, and I'm not picking it, and my official best bet is 11.5, but a couple things stand out. One, Auburn, listen, we talked about on the Aaron Torres pod. I know nobody likes Hugh Freeze. I know everybody's got their opinions on him, but if you just look at the win-loss record as opposed to the games that Auburn has played and how they have competed in said games, they've been competitive in every single game. They lost by 7 to Cal in a game they had 4 turnovers, okay? You have 2 turnovers, you beat Cal. They lost by 10 to Arkansas in a game they had 5 turnovers. That's insane. They lost by 6 to Oklahoma. They led going into the fourth quarter, had a pick 6 in that fourth quarter. They led by 14 going into the fourth quarter against Missouri. Only loss of real consequence, like with a big margin this year, was at Georgia by 18 points. And so this team has been able to be competitive with everybody on the schedule. Well, as I said, Peyton Thorne is playing better. He's not turning the ball over. Only 2 turnovers since October 1st. That's an 8-game stretch. And also on top of that, Cam Coleman has emerged and the defense is really good. From the Alabama side of things, I just got to be real. I don't know what they do on offense if Jalen Milroe isn't running the ball. Again, take out the LSU game. That offense has struggled for 3, 4, 5 weeks in a row now. Struggled against South Carolina, struggled against Tennessee. Missouri, okay. Missouri was a bunch of backups, whatever. And then LSU, Jalen Milroe goes off. Everybody thinks he's awesome. And it's like the next game, Oklahoma completely shuts him down. So Auburn will be ready for Jalen Milroe. DJ Durkin, another guy, whatever you think about him, great defensive coordinator. And I'll say this about Alabama. And this is coming straight from Alabama fans. This isn't even just Torres' opinion. Alabama's been up. Alabama's been down this year. But there's been a couple games where they just came completely unprepared to play. Now, you'd think rivalry game, you'd think everything's okay, you'd think they'd be good to go, but are we sure they're going to be good to go? I mean, remember, they were playing for an SEC championship game appearance and a college football playoff appearance last week in Norman and were a complete no-show. They were playing as the number 1 team in the country against Vandy, complete no-show. And so the idea now that they really have nothing to play for, they're not going to the SEC championship game, I would argue that I think in the stacking of 3-loss SEC teams, if we ever get there, they're at the bottom of that stack. I wouldn't put them above Ole Miss. I wouldn't put them above South Carolina. That's another conversation for another day, but it doesn't change the fact I don't know what these guys have to play for. Also worth noting, and I think this is important, Deontay Lawson, the guy who has the helmet comms in his helmet, leads the defense. There's only one guy on defense that has that in his helmet, just like there's only one quarterback. I bring it up because he got hurt in that Oklahoma game, did not return, will not play this week. He is out for the year, unfortunately. And so ultimately, am I going to pick Alabama to lose at home on senior day? I don't know that I'll go that far. But can I see this being a 24-20 type game? Yeah, I think it will be. Give me Auburn to cover in this game. The 11.5 is my best bet. By the way, remember, we're recording on Monday. So if that number goes down throughout the week or up, just keep that in mind. Interesting rivalry game. We know that this is one history, a lot always on the line, and there is actually no exception this year, even with one team disappointing. I am talking about the USC Trojans hosting Notre Dame. Notre Dame, 7.5-point road favorite in this game. The over-under set at 51.5. And like I said, you can't say there's nothing on the line here. It's been a disappointing season for USC. They come into this game in 6-5. But I'll also say this, Notre Dame, credit where it's due. They're winning the games they're supposed to. But if they were to lose this game, is 10-2 with a loss to Northern Illinois and USC playoff worthy? It would certainly be a conversation. So Notre Dame has to take care of business here, and they will unofficially clinch a college football playoff berth. For Notre Dame, let's start with them because, listen, we got to go ahead and give Marcus Freeman a little bit of credit here. Listen, I guess I would say I really have never had any strong opinion about Marcus Freeman. I liked the hire. I thought it was the right guy at the right time. First 2 years, you had your ups and downs. There were moments where you were left wanting more. But I bring it up because after that Northern Illinois loss, there was just a lot of talk. Is this really the guy? Is he the answer long-term? Blah, blah, blah. Well, all Notre Dame has done since then is win 9 straight games. And they haven't just won 9 straight games, but they've done it in really dominant fashion. I understand that the schedule isn't the greatest, but first of all, they've done something a lot of SEC teams haven't been able to do, which is win on the road in an SEC stadium at Texas A&M to open the season. But beyond that, look at some of these scores. 37-point win against Navy, 49-point win against FSU that basically made Florida State fire their whole staff except for Mike Norvell. 35-point win against Army last week, 42-point win against Stanford, 59-point win against Purdue. Since that game against Northern Illinois, basically Notre Dame has not even really played a competitive game except for one against Louisville that was pretty close. So they're winning, they're dominating, and people, if you have not seen or heard about this defense, you want to talk about an elite defense that I think can win against any, that they could be competitive against any offense in college football. This Notre Dame defense is special and it's elite. Okay. Listen, I know this is a stat-driven show. I try not to overload you with stats, but we just got to talk about this defense from a statistical perspective for a second here. Okay. How about this? Top 5 in the country in total defense. That's pretty good. Top 5 in scoring defense. They have the number 1 pass defense in all of college football, holding opponents to 139 yards per game passing. Now, I know that's a little bit of a deceptive stat because they've played Army, they've played Navy. Neither of those teams really throw the ball, but they're holding opponents to 139 yards per game passing. By the way, Texas is number 2 in pass offense. Texas is giving up 227 yards per game. So Notre Dame is better than the second best pass defense by 88 fewer yards. That is an insane stat. And they are holding opposing quarterbacks to 47% completion, which is number 1 in America. And oh, by the way, the other thing that they do insanely well, they force a lot of turnovers. They're number 2 in the country in turnover margin at plus 16. They have forced an NCAA FBS best 26 total turnovers, including 15 interceptions. So this defense flies around. They're elite. Benjamin Morrison, the defensive back, is going to be a first-round pick. They do it all on defense. And then in the run game, they are very effective as well. Don't really pass the ball a ton with Riley Leonard at quarterback, but it's, as I said, it doesn't matter because the run game is so effective. 11th ranked rush offense in America. And oh, by the way, you talk about, again, dominance, 6.26 yards per carry, which is 3rd in the country in yards per carry. unbelievably dominant season for Notre Dame. And again, because they not only haven't had high profile games, but some of their high profile opponents haven't been good, specifically Florida State, I think it has flown completely under the radar. So this defense is for real. I think this team is for real. And USC, man, they're like, what do they say? A riddle wrapped in a conundrum, wrapped into this, wrapped into that. Like, what do we make of USC right now? Because they're sitting there at 6-5. And what's weird is this: if you're looking for a reason to take USC, 4-1 in games at the Coliseum, obviously 1-0 on a neutral field, or they're 5-1 in games at the Coliseum. Excuse me, 1-0 on a neutral field. I bring it up because they are also, they've struggled away from home. What is the stat? I believe they've lost at Michigan. They lost at Minnesota. They lost at Maryland. They lost at Washington. They did get the first win of the season on the road against UCLA last week. So they've been great at home, awful on the road. This game is obviously at the Coliseum. And what's wild, though, is that even though they're 6-5, even though they haven't been able to win away from the Coliseum, the bottom line is every single game they've played was basically winnable. Michigan beats them on the final play of the game. Penn State, they lose at home. Only home loss of the year was in overtime. They had a 20-point or 14-point lead at the half. Led Maryland by double figures in the second half. On top of it, you go on and on and on down the list. Washington, they had the ball in the red zone with a chance to take the lead. Late in the game, they couldn't do it. And so, listen, this is a team that has lost some games, but they have been competitive in some games as well. Now, what's interesting, the quarterback change a few weeks ago. Jaden Mayava comes in. He has led USC to a 2-0 record. I'll be honest. Listen, I'll just say it. This is not a knock on the kid. He has led them to a 2-0 record. That's 2 more wins than I'll ever have as a college football quarterback. I don't think the play has been significantly better. I just think you were going into the bye. You were sitting there at that point at 4-5, and you had to make a quarterback change just to appease the fans. So Jaden Mayava, to his credit, 25 of 35 against Nebraska, 3 touchdowns. But last week against UCLA, 19 of 35 passing, 221 yards. That is a 54% completion percentage. And what's crazy about USC, this is a wild stat. You know that USC right now, they're ranked 84th in rush offense. That's not the crazy stat, but they're 129th in rush attempts, okay? How about this? Colorado, which we basically acknowledge doesn't even try to run the football. USC only has 24 more rush attempts on the season than Colorado. They're basically running the ball about 2 times more per game than Colorado. So it shows you, and it's interesting, living in LA, I probably hear a little bit more about this program than most, and that's been the knock on Lincoln Riley. The play calling has not been good. To the credit of the staff, though, the defense is improved across the board. So USC is an interesting team because the offense probably not as good as we expected. The defense probably a little bit better than expected. And if the offense had delivered the way we thought they would, then, oh, by the way, USC would be in much better position. So let's go ahead and make my pick on this game, and I'll be transparent. This one was a tough one. I went back and forth. And really, realistically, I got to be real. I hate taking road favorites, especially big road favorites. But I actually like Notre Dame to win, and I like Notre Dame to cover in this game. And listen, I just think sometimes in life, styles, first of all, I think Notre Dame's underrated. And I know we're preconditioned to believe that Notre Dame's terrible and they stink and that they choke in big games. Well, listen, USC is by no means vintage. But you look at the defense. I threw out the stats: top 5 total offense, top 5 total defense, top 5 scoring defense, number 1 pass defense, lowest completion percentage for opposing quarterbacks. And you look at that matchup versus a USC team that throws the ball about as much as anybody in college football, with a quarterback that's making his 3rd career start at USC. Now, I know he played at UNLV last year. But to me, this is just an awful matchup. I mean, this defensive secondary is so elite, so special, and you got a quarterback that basically is going to be back there like a sitting duck. Lincoln Riley, for whatever reason, refuses to run the ball, especially late in games, and I just think it is going to lead to a lot of 3-and-outs for USC. I think they're going to struggle to move the ball, and I think it could lead to an interception or two, not because I'm wishing ill will upon Jaden Mayava, but just because this is the best secondary that he will have seen to this point in his career. You'll go back and watch that USC-UCLA game last week. That was a game USC could have easily lost. They did win it. But listen, I just think this is a bad matchup for USC. I think they finish 6-6. They're going to go to some bowl game, and we'll be talking about Lincoln Riley all offseason. But Notre Dame, to me, is for real. I think Notre Dame gets the win. I think they get the cover. I think it's something like 27-14 or something like that, but I think it's a pretty comfortable Notre Dame win, and I do think that they cover. All right, let's keep it going. From one USC, I guess, to another. I think sometimes South Carolina fans get offended when people say that. I don't know, but let's get to the big one in the Palmetto State. It is a noon Eastern kickoff. Clemson hosting South Carolina. Clemson, believe it or not, actually a 2.5-point favorite. The over/under in this one at 49.5. And what's so interesting, one of the few games this weekend, Texas A&M is one. Both teams have huge stakes coming into this one. Both teams probably on the fringes, the outside of the college football playoff conversation. I know I've said it 30 times, so if you're listening beginning to end, I apologize. But we are recording on Monday. We don't know what the rankings look like, but there is conversation about two different things after this past weekend. Ole Miss loses, Alabama loses, Texas A&M is now in a position where they have to win probably at least their next game, if not their next two. But the conversation has been this, is one, if we ever do get down to 3-loss SEC teams, South Carolina feels like they should probably be at the top of that list. And then, oh, by the way, Clemson sitting there at 9-2. If they win this game, that would obviously be a great win to close the regular season. Really, the only loss of the two losses, one could be to the SEC champ in Georgia. And so I only bring it up because you look at Clemson, and there are a lot of people saying that not necessarily that they should get into the college football playoff, but if something weird happens, if Notre Dame loses to USC, if Penn State loses this weekend, if Indiana loses to Purdue, could Clemson get in as an at-large? Obviously, if they do not make the ACC championship game, that is probably also a note I should leave here as well. SMU has clinched a spot in the ACC championship game. If Miami beats Syracuse, Miami goes to Charlotte for the ACC championship game. If Miami loses, then Clemson would have a chance to play for the ACC title. And so really, whether they win or lose, it'd be moot if they go to the ACC title game. But let's focus on this game. Let's focus on South Carolina to start. And I got to start giving credit where it's due. I have not historically been a Shane Beamer guy. I've never, nothing personal. I just, I've thought he's a fine coach, whatever. I got to be real. I did not see this coming, okay? To use the Shaq meme, Shane Beamer, I was not familiar with your game. So credit to Shane Beamer. Early in the season, this team took a few losses, but if you watch those games, the Alabama game, they easily could have won. The LSU game, if Lenora Sellers, their starting quarterback, doesn't get hurt, they probably win that game. And so they're 8-3. They've obviously got a couple great wins, including Texas A&M at home. If they win this game, it is going to be a strong argument that they should be in the conversation as a 3-loss SEC team. And they're really, to their credit, doing it on both sides of the football. Because early in the season, we all talked about the defense and the defensive front, and we're going to get to that in a minute. But credit where it's due. Their starting quarterback, Lenora Sellers, has really emerged over the last 2 or 3 weeks, okay? Really the last 4, if you think about it, because in his last 4 games, so since the first game of November, which was A&M, Lenora Sellers, how about this? 12 touchdown passes, 2 interceptions, okay? And he has 17 on the season, 17 touchdown passes, 6 interceptions. So before November 1st, 5 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. Since November 1st, 12 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. He is improving. Rocket Sanders has had a couple big games on the ground. And then it is always worth noting that defense is elite and that defense is special. Top 15 in total defense, top 15 in scoring defense, number 12 in rush defense. And those defensive linemen get after it. Kyle Kennard, Dylan Stewart. Kyle Kennard, listen, when Texas A&M played South Carolina, Mike Elko said he believed Kyle Kennard and Dylan Stewart will be first-round picks. Kyle Kennard this coming year, Dylan Stewart when he's eligible. But 39 total sacks, that is 3rd in the country. For Clemson, listen, gave South Carolina some credit earlier, gave Shane Beamer some credit. We got to give Dabo some credit as well. Because when you look at Dabo, when you look at this program, listen, I was one of those guys. After the season opening loss to Georgia, I was one of those guys Dabo's losing it. He's lost his fastball. College football has passed him by. They have no depth because of the portal. They're not very good. And then you see that quietly they have gotten better. And the big reason that Clemson is sitting here at 9-2 and on the fringes of the playoff conversation is because that Garrett Riley offense is finally clicking. Okay. So we all know, but remember 2 years ago, Garrett Riley was coming off a run to the national championship game as TCU's offensive coordinator. He was the hottest name in the coordinator market. That was the year that Jimbo Fisher, remember, was trying to hire a coordinator. He ends up with Bobby Petrino. Nick Saban is looking for an offensive coordinator. He ends up hiring Tommy Rees. Well, Garrett Riley ends up at Clemson. Last year, it was a struggle. This year, they have been phenomenal, okay? You look at this offense and you look at what they have done. Number 6 in the country in total offense, top 25 in pass offense and pass rushing offense. So there's a lot of balance there. And just look at the point totals. We said it with Notre Dame. I don't care who you're playing. 66 against App State, 59 against NC State, 40 against Stanford, 49 against Wake Forest, 48 against Virginia. Last couple weeks on the road, they did struggle 24 apiece at Pitt and at Virginia Tech, but they're at home. I got to give Cade Klubnik a little bit of credit as well. He was a guy that I was very critical of last year. 29 passing touchdowns, 4 interceptions on the season. He also, oh, by the way, he's also got 5 rushing touchdowns as well. Phil Maffa in the backfield. So you look at this game, top 20 matchup, college football playoff implications. Who is going to be Torres' official pick? I'll just say it. I actually like Clemson to cover the 2.5. Okay. And so let me explain why. This is not a knock on South Carolina. It's not that they're terrible, but a couple things stand out. One, home field advantage matters. We see it every single week in college football. I'm sure Dabo would much rather have a 7:30 kickoff than a noon Eastern kickoff, but home field matters. But here's the other thing. This is what stands out. One, listen, I'm not trying to diminish what South Carolina has done the last 5 weeks. They are on a 5-game winning streak. As I said, Lenora Sellers is playing out of his mind. He deserves all the credit in the world. But let's look at who they beat. They won at Oklahoma. That was the game where, if you remember, they were up 21-0 in a game where they were up 21-0. What was it, about 6 minutes into the game? They scored on the opening drive and then a pick six and then a fumble return for a touchdown. So they jumped on them early. And then from there, they have beaten, this is who they've beaten. They beat Texas A&M at home. Great game. Don't want to take anything away from them. At Vandy, Missouri at home by 4, Wofford last week. So basically, in that stretch, you got a couple home games. The road games were one game where the other team basically spotted you 21 points, and the other one was Vandy, where you probably had more fans there than they did, okay? So it's not a knock, but it is going to be completely different going on the road to Clemson. I know you'll have plenty of your own fans if you're a South Carolina fan, but I don't think that it changes the fact that that is just going to be a really tough place to play. But here's the other thing. Clemson's a really good football team, and Clemson is a really good football team. And the one thing I'll say about Clemson is that with South Carolina, we talked about the pass rush. We talked about the run defense. The one thing about South Carolina, they have been a little bit susceptible. If you can keep your quarterback upright in the pocket, that secondary is very good. It is not elite. As a matter of fact, I think it's worth noting. Look at South Carolina's 2 losses this year. Who are they to? Well, the 3 losses. They lose to Alabama, a game they easily could have won. But the 2 other losses, they were to LSU when Garrett Nussmeier threw for just under 300 yards and about 8 yards per completion. And the second loss was to Ole Miss. Now, part of it was Ole Miss defense was phenomenal in that game, but Jackson Dart threw for about 300 yards in that game as well. So I don't think it's a coincidence. The 2 best pass offenses that you've seen, you've struggled against, the 2 best pass offenses you've seen, you've lost to. And I just think that Clemson is flying under the radar. With Clemson, the offense is clicking. The defense is probably a little bit better than people realize. You know, you look at the raw stats and you sit there and say, oh, they're not that good. And it's like, well, I mean, that's not totally fair because of the fact that if you look at Clemson, a lot of the points they've given up are games that have long since been decided. You know, they gave up 31 points against Virginia. 21 of them were in the fourth quarter. They beat NC State, gave up 35 against NC State. 21 were in the third quarter. 28 were in the second half when the game was long since decided. So I like Clemson to win. I like Clemson to cover. I'll say something in the neighborhood of like 24-16, 24-17. Clemson wins. Clemson stays alive in the college football playoff race. We'll see, by the way, if they can get to the ACC title game. All right, really quickly, last deep dive of the day. Do want to get to one other game, and the game that I want to get to, the last deep dive, Colorado hosting Oklahoma State. Now, it's worth noting, this is a Black Friday game. It is a noon Eastern, 10 a.m. Mountain Time kickoff. So another early kickoff for Coach Prime and the Buffs. Colorado, a 16.5-point favorite over a team that was in the top 20 in the preseason. Over under set at 65.5. Let's talk Colorado for half a second because, listen, I think you could argue, listen, they're not, as far along as a program as Alabama, even with a first-year head coach in Kalen DeBoer. They're not as far along as Ole Miss. I think the loss on Saturday to Kansas was as disappointing as any loss, not just because you put yourself out of, or I don't want to say out of, Colorado fans don't get mad at me, but you're kind of in the back part of the Big 12 title conversation. But it was also the effort in that game. Okay. So by the way, for people who don't know kind of the standings and where things stand, Colorado now, basically there's 4 teams tied atop the Big 12 going into this weekend: Iowa State, BYU, Arizona State, and Colorado. Basically, Colorado loses essentially every tiebreaker and would really need 2 of those teams to lose to get back into the Big 12 title chase. So it was disappointing because you lose. But I think it was disappointing because it was really the first game all year, at least since the Nebraska game in week 2, where Colorado just showed up not ready to play. And listen, if I'm going to criticize Kalen DeBoer, if I'm going to criticize Lane Kiffin, got to criticize this team and this program as well for just not showing up in a position ready to play. You watch this game, it was unbelievable. First of all, and Brock Hewitt and Jason Benetti talked about it on the broadcast. Kansas put up 23 points in the first half, and it felt like they left a lot of points on the field. It was a weird game where they scored on the first 5 possessions, but they had to settle for 3 field goals, and it felt like it could have and should have been more. And then the second half comes out, and you basically cannot get Kansas off of the field, and they just completely controlled the clock in the second half. They only scored 14 points. They only had to score 14 points because they finished the game with 333 yards rushing, just rushing. 333 yards rushing, 6 yards per carry. The Devin Neal kid was unbelievable. 207 yards, 3 touchdowns. He was phenomenal, but I think it was just disappointing because we've seen Colorado. We know what they're capable of, and that was the frustrating part. We know what they're capable of. We know that they're better than that. And so to see that effort, I think was just a bummer. From the offensive perspective, listen, Shedeur did what he had to do, 265 yards, 3 passing. Travis Hunter had 2 more touchdowns in this game. But, Kansas kept everything in front of them. No really, really big deep balls. And then obviously Colorado is never going to run the ball a lot, but only 43 yards rushing on 12 carries. But I'm not going to blame Pat Shurmur, the offensive coordinator, because when you give up so many points so quickly, sometimes, you get behind the chains, you get behind the score, you got to pass the ball more. So Colorado was disappointing last week. Oklahoma State has been disappointing all year. Oklahoma State, I think you can argue, is maybe the most, they're right up there with Florida State, with USC, with whoever, as the most disappointing teams in all of college football this year. Okay. Again, how about this? They didn't only start the season, as I said, in the top 20. They started 3-0, beat South Dakota State, Arkansas, Tulsa. Then they lose their Big 12 opener to Utah. That was the first game Cam Rising was out. And it has just been a train wreck ever since then, as they are now 0-8 in the Big 12 coming into this game. And the disappointing thing is the defense has just fallen off of a cliff. 42 points allowed to Kansas State, 38 to West Virginia, 38 to BYU, 38 to Baylor, 42 to Arizona State, 38 to TCU, 56 last week in a loss to Texas Tech. And so as we enter this game, how about this? Oklahoma State currently in the FBS, okay? They are currently 118th in points per game allowed, giving up 34 per game. And that number is a little bit deceptive because they only gave up 10 one week. And, they've had moments where they didn't give up a lot of points, but 34 per game, that's worst in the Big 12 outside of Texas Tech. And I think more importantly, the offense just hasn't been very consistent. Obviously, Alan Bowman was the starter to start the season. I was never a huge Alan Bowman guy, but he's been out the last couple weeks. They've actually played a freshman the last few weeks who did not play terribly. And if you're looking for some type of silver lining, it was admittedly against a bad Texas Tech defense, but they did have 556 yards of total offense, 353 yards passing, 203 yards rushing in that game. Now, in terms of this game, in terms of my best bet, in terms of my pick, I know the number is huge, but I'll tell you what, I am going to go ahead and take Colorado minus 16.5. That is a monster number. But first of all, let's call a spade a spade. It's not that Colorado is incapable of putting up it's like that. I mean, remember, they beat Utah by 25 the other week. They beat Texas Tech by 14. They beat UCF by 27 earlier in the year. And so they can do what they got to do. I think it's also worth noting this is just a bad matchup for Oklahoma State. First of all, you're going on the road, freshman quarterback, and you're playing a defense that's going to be pissed off, okay? Colorado, to its credit, the defense we've talked about quite a bit is a much improved defense. But I think what's also significant about Colorado is Colorado has 20 total takeaways this year, 10 turnovers, 10 interceptions, 10 fumbles recovered. That stat of 20 total turnovers forced, number 2 in the Big 12 behind only BYU. So you have a freshman quarterback going on the road for a team that has largely pretty much quit this season in Oklahoma State. And I think you also have a Colorado. Remember, they are the first team of those teams in that conversation for the Big 12 title that is playing this weekend. They play on Black Friday at noon Eastern. Iowa State does not play until Saturday night when they host Kansas State. BYU does not play until Saturday night late when they host Houston. And Arizona State does not play until Saturday when they host Arizona. So if you're Colorado, the pressure's kind of off. Like, you win this game, you get to sit home on Saturday and see if there's carnage around you. All the pressure now goes to Iowa State, goes to Arizona State, goes to whatever. And so I think it's a bad matchup for Oklahoma State. I think they've given up on the season. You got to remember, traveling, road game, Black Friday. It's a 10 a.m. local time kickoff. I like Colorado to win. I like Colorado to cover. Give me Colorado 49-21. By the way, I think that over could probably hit as well. I'm going to stay away from that over in that game. That's just a little bit too much for me. Really quickly, a couple other games that are just worth noting. No deep dive previews. One game that I'm going to look into, Georgia Tech, a 19.5-point underdog at Georgia. Georgia Tech's not a terrible team. Listen, we all remember Georgia Tech from week 0 against FSU. That win meant nothing. But remember, this is a team that beat Miami a few weeks ago. This is a team that's sitting there at 7-4 coming into this game. And you look at their losses: Notre Dame, at Virginia Tech, at Syracuse. Not saying that those teams are the quality of Georgia, at least other than outside of Notre Dame. I don't think some of those teams are terrible, though, especially on the road. I could see Georgia keeping it close, Georgia Tech keeping it close. I probably won't bet it, but that game intrigues me. That game, by the way, is also a Black Friday game, I should mention. Florida State, this was the one that we thought was going to get Billy Napier bowl eligible potentially. They are bowl eligible at 6-5. Now you can go to 7-5. They play at Florida State, a 14.5-point favorite, over under 45.5. Total stay away to me. Florida's going to win. I don't know what the final score will be. I don't know if Florida State, like Oklahoma State a minute ago, is going to show up ready to play. I mean, listen, Florida State played Charleston Southern last week. It was nothing at half after the first quarter. Now, it ended up being 41-7 as a final score, but it was 0-0 after the first quarter. So stay away from me on that one. A couple other intriguing games. Oregon hosting Washington. Oregon, a 19.5-point favorite. Stay away from me. That Iowa State-Kansas State game is huge. Iowa State, I know I said a minute ago that Colorado basically controls 0 tiebreakers in the Big 12 standings. Well, Iowa State basically controls all of them If Iowa State is to win that game, they will go to the Big 12 championship game. As far as some other stuff, the Egg Bowl, certainly not a game that I have very much interest in. Ole Miss, a 26.5-point favorite. You'd think they'd show up. I think that Ole Miss probably thinks that they're still in the playoff conversation, but you got to win that one. Missouri, only a 3.5-point favorite against Arkansas. I may look into that one more. Arkansas is kind of the ultimate zigzag team. Every time you think they're awesome, they lose. Every time you give up on them, they play well. Wouldn't be stunned if they pull off the upset there. And then another one worth noting, Miami at Syracuse. Remember, Miami has to win that game on the road to go to the ACC championship game. Miami, a 10.5-point favorite. The over under in that one is 67.5. All right, I'll tell you what, I think that's it for this episode of College Football Betting. I think I'm going to go ahead and get out of here. I've given you enough content for a Tuesday. If you're not subscribed to the Aaron Torres pod, please make sure to do so. If you're not subscribed to College Football Betting, please make sure to do so. Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Music, wherever you get your podcast, please make sure that you are subscribed to College Football Betting. Also, make sure to rate and review the show. Go ahead, give us a quick 5 stars. Let us know what you like, what you don't like. Follow College Football Betting on YouTube. Follow the Aaron Torres pod on YouTube. But most importantly, let me say this. I'm going to be traveling on Tuesday. I will be going to the Duke-Kansas game Tuesday night in Vegas. But I only bring it up because some of you won't hear me on the Aaron Torres pod. So if this is the College Football Betting pod that you listen to, I want to say this. I hope everybody has a great Thanksgiving. I am so blessed to do what I do. I am so appreciative of anyone, even the haters, who take a minute out of their day to listen to the show, to take time to consume the show. You all are the best. I couldn't live my life without you guys. So that's all for today's show. Appreciate everybody's support. For the Aaron Torres pod crowd, I will be back Tuesday night. And then, of course, for the college football betting crowd, I'll be back to preview some conference championship games next week. Take care, everybody.